The night the laughter stopped. Nobody in Hollywood ever expected to see Dean Martin cry in public. Not the fans who had grown up watching him glide across stages with a drink in his hand and a smile that never seemed to fade. Not the executives who had watched him outlast scandals, trends, and even the collapse of the Rat Pack. And not even the men who had stood beside him for decades, men like Frank Sinatra, who believed Dean was carved from a softer version of stone, unbreakable, untouchable, and immune to visible pain. For most of his life, Dean had mastered the art of making the world feel lighter than it really was. He laughed through heartbreak, joked through exhaustion, and swallowed grief so quietly that even his closest friends sometimes forgot it was there. But in the final months of the 1980s, in the quiet shadow of a hospital that smelled of antiseptic and fading hope, something began to shift. Something was coming that would crack the image the world had built around him, and only one man could bring it out. 3 weeks before Sammy Davis Jr. would leave the world, his body had already begun its slow, visible surrender. The throat cancer that had once been discussed in careful whispers was now an undeniable presence in every room he entered. It had thinned him, weakened him, stolen most of the power from a voice that had once filled theaters without a microphone. Doctors spoke gently but honestly. Time was no longer measured in years or even months. It was measured in days, sometimes in hours. Yet Sammy refused to become silent. Even when speaking hurt, even when each sentence scraped his throat raw, he still asked for people, still asked about music, still joked with nurses, still wanted to know who was rehearsing where, what stories were floating around Vegas, what songs were being played too loudly in hotel bars. He smiled the same Sammy smile, softer now, more fragile, but unmistakably his. And through all of it, there was one name he mentioned more than any other. Dean. He asked about him constantly, whether he was all right, whether anyone had seen him, whether he was still staying up in that quiet house where the lights rarely changed and the curtains were almost always drawn. And every time when someone would answer gently that Dean hadn't visited yet, Sammy would nod as if he understood something the others didn't. Dean Martin hadn't stayed away because he didn't care. He stayed away because he cared too much. 2 years earlier, his life had split open in a way it never truly closed again. His son, Dean Paul Martin, had died suddenly in a jet crash, a loss that didn't feel real even when the funeral ended, even when the house filled with flowers, even when the calls slowed and the world quietly went on. After that, Dean didn't return to stages. He didn't return to studios. He didn't return to the man the public recognized. People called it retirement. People called it rest. But those who knew him well called it what it was, a man surviving inside the ruins of his own heart. He stopped singing not because he was tired of music, but because music had become a place where his son still existed. And that hurt too much. So when the call finally came, when Sammy's manager's voice grew serious and said, "He keeps asking for you, Dean. He wants to see you now," Dean didn't answer right away. He sat with the phone in his hand long after the line went quiet. He stared at it the way people stare at doors they know will change everything once they open them. He had already said goodbye to his child. He didn't believe he had another goodbye left inside him. But this wasn't a request from a public figure or a dying legend. This was a request from his brother, and that was different. Dean arrived at Cedars-Sinai late at night, long after most visitors were gone. He wore a dark suit even though there was no one to impress, no cameras waiting, no stage to step onto. It was habit, but it was also armor. He had lost weight. His shoulders sloped more than they used to. His eyes carried the kind of tiredness sleep doesn't cure. A nurse recognized him before she meant to, her breath catching softly in her throat. "Mr. Martin," she said, lowering her voice instinctively, "he's been waiting for you." Dean nodded, but he didn't trust his voice. The hallway felt too long, too quiet, each step echoing with memories he hadn't invited. As he walked, the years moved with him. He saw Sammy backstage in a mirror-lined room, rehearsing footwork that never seemed to touch the floor. He heard him laughing in crowded hallways, turning stress into celebration. He felt the old nights again, the ones where exhaustion didn't matter and tomorrow felt like something guaranteed. They had danced through life together. They had survived storms that were supposed to break them. They had believed once that there would always be another show. When he reached the door, he stopped. Inside the room, machines hummed softly, the sound steady and impersonal. Sammy lay in the bed beneath thin blankets, his frame smaller than Dean remembered, his breathing slow and deliberate. For a moment, Dean didn't move. He stood in the doorway like a man who had walked too far into a memory and wasn't sure how to come back. He almost turned away. Then Sammy's eyes opened. It took him a second to focus, And then recognition settled across his face, followed by a smile that seemed to rise from somewhere deeper than his pain. "Dino," he whispered. The voice was weak, but the warmth was still there. The same warmth that had once lit up Vegas and turned crowded rooms into home. Dean stepped forward, every controlled expression he had ever worn failing him all at once. Sammy lifted his hand slightly, and Dean took it carefully, afraid of the bones beneath his skin, afraid of the reality his eyes kept trying to soften. The moment their hands met, Sammy closed his eyes as if something inside him had finally unclenched. "You took your time, baby," Sammy murmured. Dean swallowed. "I didn't want to see you like this." Sammy smiled faintly. "Well, tough luck, this is all I got today." They looked at each other in silence. Two men who had outlived headlines, outlived eras, outlived versions of themselves. Two men who had once felt invincible and now felt very human. Then Sammy's expression changed. The humor faded. Something focused and urgent took its place. "Sit down," he whispered. Dean pulled the chair closer and lowered himself into it, his hand still holding Sammy's. The room felt smaller now. Sammy took a slow breath, gathering what strength he could. "I need to tell you something," he said. Dean didn't interrupt. He didn't look away. "You think you broke," Sammy continued quietly. "After your boy died, after the shows stopped, after the world kept moving without you, you think you broke." Dean lowered his eyes, unable to deny it. Sammy squeezed his hand, surprising him with the pressure. "But listen to me, baby. I'm running out of voice, so don't waste this." He waited until Dean looked back at him. "You didn't break. You just forgot who you are." The words didn't land softly. They struck. Dean blinked, the room blurring slightly. Sammy's breathing grew uneven, but he pressed on. "People see the jokes, the drinks, the cool, but I saw the real deal. I saw the man who carried people when they were tired. The man who made rooms lighter just by walking into them. You weren't cool, Dino. You were brave." Dean's jaw tightened. Sammy leaned closer, his voice barely more than breath. "And you're still brave, even now, even hurting. You're still my brother." He paused, then added, "And I need you to hear this before I go." Dean felt something tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with fear. "Don't disappear on me." The words settled between them, heavy and intimate. Dean opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came. Sammy's smile returned, gentler now, almost grateful. "You survived the worst," he whispered. "Now survive me too." Then, with what little strength remained, Sammy said the words that would echo long after the machines fell silent. "Dino, I love you, and you were the best part of my life." Dean closed his eyes. For the first time in years, his face betrayed him. His breath shook. His grip tightened. He didn't cry yet, not there, not then, but something deep inside him fractured open. He sat frozen, holding Sammy's hand as the machines continued their steady rhythm, reminding him that time was still moving, whether he wanted it to or not. A nurse stepped in quietly and adjusted the blankets. "He'll sleep for a while now," she whispered. Dean nodded, rose slowly, and walked out. But he didn't leave alone. Something followed him into the hallway, a feeling he hadn't recognized in years. Not grief, not shock, something heavier, purpose. And as he leaned against the cool wall, hands trembling, he whispered words he wasn't sure he believed yet. "You didn't break, you just forgot who you are." The place where their laughter still lived. Dean Martin did not drive home the way most men would after leaving a hospital room like that. He didn't head toward comfort. He didn't head toward noise. He didn't head toward the familiar patterns that usually numbed the edges of grief. Instead, he drove with the radio off, the city lights sliding across his windshield like soft, restless ghosts. His hands stayed steady on the wheel, but his chest felt like it had been cracked open and left exposed to cold air. Sammy's words kept repeating in his mind, not as a dramatic farewell, not as a Hollywood speech, but as something raw and personal, the kind of truth that doesn't ask permission before it lodges itself inside you. You didn't break. You just forgot who you are. Dean tried to swallow it down like he'd swallowed every other sharp feeling in his life, but it wouldn't go away. It sat right behind his ribs, heavier than his grief because it carried something grief never carried, an instruction. He passed streets he used to know by heart, neighborhoods where billboards still carried the faces of younger men, men who smiled like time was something they controlled. The world outside continued like nothing had happened, like no man had just whispered love into another man's trembling hands while machines hummed beside them. That was the cruel magic of life. It kept moving even when the heart begged for a pause. Dean's eyes felt hot, but he refused the tears the way he always had, by tightening his jaw and focusing on the road. He had built a whole identity on not falling apart in public. The cool one. The man who could turn pain into charm and loss into laughter. And yet tonight, he felt that identity slipping like a jacket that no longer fit. He didn't realize he was heading toward Las Vegas until the skyline began to announce itself in the distance. Bright, loud, impossible to ignore. The strip rose like a neon river, pulsing with life, with noise, with the kind of celebration that pretended sadness didn't exist. Dean slowed the car as if he were approaching a sacred place that had once been holy to him and was now haunted. He had tried to leave this city behind when his son died, because the laughter here reminded him too much of the days when he still believed laughter could protect him. But Sammy's voice had pulled him back, not the real voice from the stage. This new thin whisper from the hospital bed, commanding him not to vanish. When he parked across from a familiar casino, he sat for a long moment without stepping out. He stared at the glowing letters and the revolving lights, and for a second he saw it as it used to be. The crowds lined up in suits and dresses, the air thick with perfume and cigarette smoke, the excitement buzzing like electricity. He could almost hear a band tuning up, almost hear Frank's voice joking backstage, almost hear Sammy's tap shoes striking wood like thunder. In those days, this city had felt like a playground and a kingdom at the same time. Their names weren't just famous, they were permanent. Dean had once believed there was no ending to that kind of power, but endings came anyway. They came quietly, then suddenly, then all at once. Dean stepped out of the car and the cool desert air hit his face. It carried the faint scent of car exhaust, distant food stands, and something sharper beneath it, memory. As he crossed the street slowly, people stared. Not in the hungry way fans once stared, but in the startled way people stare when they see a legend in the wrong era. Some recognized him and froze, their mouths slightly open. Others didn't know who he was, but they sensed something about him, his posture, his age, his silent gravity, that made them look twice. Dean kept his head slightly down, moving forward like a man walking through his own past. Inside the casino, the noise wrapped around him instantly. Coins clinking, laughter bursting, music pounding from somewhere deeper in the building. A young couple walked past without noticing him, their hands intertwined, their faces bright with expectation. Dean watched them for a second longer than he meant to, because youth always carried a cruel innocence. Youth believed the people you love will always be there. Youth believed the fun will always return. Dean turned away and moved through the crowd without stopping, as if following a map only he could see. He found his way to the showroom that had once been their stage. It wasn't the same now. It had been remodeled, renamed, modernized, stripped of some of its old character in exchange for sleek lighting and polished walls. But the bones of the place were still there. The angle of the hallway, the curve of the entrance, the way the air changed when you crossed into the performance space, those things remained. A security guard stepped in front of him, surprised, uncertain. "Sir, we're closed for the night," the guard said, trying to sound firm even though his eyes had widened with recognition. Dean didn't argue, he didn't demand, he simply looked at the man and spoke with a quiet calm that carried more authority than shouting ever could. "I just want a minute," he said. "That's all." The guard hesitated, then glanced around as if checking for a supervisor, but there was no one. The guard finally nodded, stepping aside like he was letting a ghost pass into an old chapel. "1 minute," he murmured. Dean entered the showroom. The stage was dark, the chairs mostly stacked, the room quiet except for the soft hum of distant cleaning equipment. A janitor stood near the edge of the stage, sweeping slowly, his movements steady and unhurried. He looked up when Dean approached, and his face shifted into confusion, then recognition, then disbelief. Are you?" the janitor began. Dean raised a hand gently, cutting off the question. "Just let me look," he said. His voice was polite, almost soft, but the emotion behind it made the words heavier than they sounded. He climbed the steps to the stage like a man walking into a memory. Each step felt louder than it should have. When his shoes touched the wooden floor, something inside him tightened. This stage had held them in their prime, Frank with his confident control, Sammy with his electricity, Dean with his effortless charm that looked like it required no effort at all. The stage had been their playground, their battlefield, their place of brotherhood and chaos. Dean walked to center stage and stopped. He stared into the empty room, and for a moment he didn't see the stacked chairs or the darkness. He saw packed tables, faces lifted toward them, laughter rising like waves. He saw Sammy dancing, spinning, teasing the crowd with that unstoppable energy. He heard the applause like thunder in his ears, even though the room was silent now. Dean closed his eyes, and the silence became the loudest thing in the world. He remembered Sammy's smile in the hospital bed. He remembered his thin hand squeezing Dean's with surprising strength. He remembered the whisper, "Don't disappear on me." And for the first time since his son's death, Dean felt something push back against the emptiness. Not happiness, he wasn't ready for that, not peace, he didn't deserve it yet in his own mind, but something else. A sense that maybe disappearing wasn't the same as healing, that maybe hiding wasn't the same as surviving. That maybe he'd been confusing numbness for strength. A small sound behind him broke the moment. The janitor had moved closer, still holding his broom, his face careful like he didn't want to disturb something fragile. "You used to own this room," the janitor said, not in a fanboy way, but in a respectful way, like he was speaking to someone who had carried a piece of history. "My dad played your records when I was a kid. He said you made people forget their problems for a while." Dean opened his eyes and stared at the man. The words hit him harder than applause ever had because applause didn't demand anything. It was just noise. But this man's sentence carried meaning. It reminded Dean of something he had tried to forget, that what he did wasn't just entertainment. It had been escape for strangers, comfort for people who needed a laugh because life was heavy. It had been a gift, even if he had never thought of it that way. Dean swallowed, his throat suddenly tight. "Sammy did that," he said quietly. "He made it lighter." The janitor nodded slowly, then said something that made Dean's breath pause. "Maybe you did too," the man said. "Sometimes the one who looks calm is the one doing the most work." Dean looked away toward the dark seats, toward the empty tables, toward the silence that had replaced the roaring crowds. He didn't respond right away because the truth was too close to his heart. He had spent decades being the calm one, the smooth one, the unshakable one. But the calm had always been a performance too. The calm had been armor. Dean walked toward the front edge of the stage and stared down at the empty room again, his reflection faintly caught in a dark glass panel near the side. He looked older than he remembered. The grief had carved lines into his face that charm couldn't erase. But beneath that, there was still him. Still the man Sammy had described, the brave one, the heart, the brother who didn't let people feel alone. He whispered softly into the empty air, not for the janitor, not for the casino staff, not for the ghosts of applause, but as if the words might travel through the city and reach a hospital room miles away. "I'm still here, Sam." The sentence trembled as it left his mouth. And when it did, something inside him loosened. Not all the way, not enough to undo the grief, but enough to make space for something new, the idea that showing up, truly showing up, might be the only way to honor the people he loved. When Dean stepped off the stage and walked back down the steps, the janitor didn't stop him or speak again. The man simply watched with a kind of quiet respect, like he understood that this wasn't a celebrity moment. It was a human moment. Dean passed the security guard and gave him a small nod. The guard nodded back, still stunned. Outside, the strip lights flickered, relentless and bright, like the city was refusing to acknowledge that anyone could be dying right now. Dean walked to his car slowly, his shoulders heavy but his steps slightly steadier than before. He sat behind the wheel, staring at his hands for a moment. They looked the same, but they didn't feel the same. Sammy's hand had been in his. Sammy's voice had been in his ears. Sammy's love had been placed into him like a final gift. And gifts, even painful ones, demanded a response. He drove home before sunrise, the road quieter now, the city slowly fading behind him. When he opened the front door of his house, the silence greeted him like it always did, but tonight it didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a waiting room, like something was about to happen, and the house itself was holding its breath. Dean walked into his study, a room that still carried pieces of the man he used to be. Awards were tucked away, not displayed. Old photographs were turned slightly inward, as if he couldn't bear to see faces frozen in happier time. He opened a drawer and pulled out a small velvet box he hadn't touched in years. Inside was a gold bracelet, the same one Sammy had given him after a benefit show long ago, when they were younger and believed time was endless. Dean had refused to wear it then, joking that it was too flashy. Sammy had laughed and said, "Baby, you're Italian, flashy is in your blood." Dean held it now, turning it over in his palm like it was a relic. The gold caught the early morning light and glowed softly, almost warm. After a long moment, Dean put it on. The bracelet sat heavy on his wrist, not because of the metal, but because of what it represented. Friendship that outlasted fame, love that outlasted pride, brotherhood that refused to die quietly. Dean sat at his desk, pulled a piece of paper toward him, and picked up a pen. For a long time, he didn't write. He just stared at the blank page, listening to the silence, feeling his breath, letting the weight of everything settle without running from it. Finally, he wrote one simple sentence. "Show up tomorrow." He stared at the words, then folded the paper carefully and slid it into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, as if he were placing it close to his heart where it belonged. He looked down at the bracelet again and whispered, almost like a promise to the air itself, "I'm coming back, Sam." And when the sun rose fully over the quiet house, Dean Martin did something he hadn't done in a very long time. He let himself believe, even if only for a second, that he might still be able to keep a promise. Because the truth was, the next time he walked into that hospital room, Sammy would not just be asking for company. Sammy would be asking for something deeper. Something that would force Dean to face the part of himself he had hidden from the world for decades. And whether Dean was ready or not, that moment was coming. The promise between brothers. Dean Martin woke before the sun had fully claimed the sky. The house was still dim, still wrapped in that familiar quiet that had lived there ever since grief moved in and refused to leave. But this morning, the silence felt different. It was no longer empty. It felt expectant, like a held breath. He lay in bed for several minutes without moving, staring at the faint light creeping along the ceiling, listening to the slow rhythm of his own breathing. Normally, mornings were the hardest. They always carried the cruel surprise of remembering all over again. But today, something steadier sat beneath the ache. He could still feel Sammy's hand in his. He could still hear the whisper in his ear. And he could still feel the weight of the bracelet on his wrist, resting there like a quiet reminder that love didn't end when voices did. When Dean finally stood, he didn't reach for the television or the radio the way he used to when he wanted noise to drown out thought. He washed his face slowly, watching himself in the mirror. The man looking back at him seemed unfamiliar and familiar at the same time. Older, yes, thinner, marked by time in ways the camera angles of his past never showed. But the eyes were still his, and behind them was still a man who had once walked into rooms and changed how they felt. Sammy had seen that man. And if Sammy had seen him, then maybe he hadn't disappeared as completely as he thought. Dean dressed carefully, the way he always had, but not out of vanity. It was ritual. It was how he prepared himself to face whatever waited on the other side of the door. He slipped the folded note from his pocket and read it again. "Show up tomorrow." The words were simple, but they felt heavier than any speech he had ever delivered. He put the note back, straightened his jacket, and ran his fingers once over the bracelet, feeling its cool surface against his skin. For the first time since his son's death, he did not feel like he was walking into something to endure. He felt like he was walking into something to honor. The drive to the hospital was quiet, the streets still waking, the sky soft with early color. Dean did not turn on music. He did not want to cover the thoughts forming inside him. They were not all gentle, some were sharp, some were afraid, some were full of questions he couldn't answer. But beneath them all was a single steady awareness. Whatever happened today, he would not run from it. He would not disappear. When he stepped into Cedars-Sinai, the smell of antiseptic and coffee greeted him, familiar now, almost intimate. He nodded to a nurse at the desk, and she nodded back, recognition immediate. Word had spread quietly through the floor the night before. People knew who had been in that room. They knew what it meant. As Dean approached Sammy's door, he slowed. He could hear voices inside, soft, careful voices. He paused, instinctively giving space. After a moment, the door opened and Sammy's wife stepped out. Her face was tired, but calm in the way that only comes when tears have already done their worst work. "He's awake," she said quietly, "and he keeps asking if you came back." Dean nodded. "I'm here." She held his gaze for a second, something grateful passing between them, then stepped aside. Dean entered. The room was brighter than the night before, sunlight touching the curtains and sliding gently across the walls. Sammy lay in the bed, thinner still, but awake. His eyes lit up when he saw Dean, not with excitement, but with recognition so deep it almost hurt to witness. "Well," Sammy whispered, a faint smile forming, "you actually showed up." Dean moved to the chair beside him. "I told you I would." Sammy's eyes drifted down to Dean's wrist. The bracelet caught the light. A soft laugh escaped him, more breath than sound. "Look at that," he murmured. "Took you long enough." Dean covered the bracelet with his other hand. "Only one I ever needed," he said quietly. They sat in silence for a moment, and it wasn't the heavy silence of unsaid things. It was the kind that exists when two people know each other well enough that words feel optional. Sammy's breathing was uneven, but his expression was calm. After a while, he spoke again, his voice more serious. "Dino, we need to talk." Dean leaned closer. "I'm listening." Sammy took a slow breath, as if measuring how much strength he had left. Everyone keeps coming in here trying to make me comfortable, he said. Trying to distract me, trying to act like this is just another bad week. But you and me, we don't do pretend. He looked at Dean directly. I'm leaving, and I don't want fear to be the last thing I feel. The words settled in the air between them. Dean did not rush to answer. He knew better. What do you want, Sam? He asked quietly. I want to leave like I lived, Sammy whispered. Honest, aware, not alone. He reached out his hand, trembling, and Dean took it immediately. I need you here for that. Dean felt his throat tighten. I'm here. Sammy nodded. Good, then help me with something. He paused, then said the words slowly, carefully. I want you to choose the music for my last day. Dean's breath caught. Music had always been sacred to them. It had been their language, their shield, their way of telling the world who they were when words failed. Sam, he began. I don't want a big goodbye, Sammy continued. No spectacle, no pretending I'm still invincible. I want something that sounds like truth, something that feels like us. Dean looked down at their joined hands. He could almost hear 1,000 songs in his head, but only one feeling. I'll think about it, he said. Sammy smiled faintly. That's all I'm asking. They rested again, the machines keeping time beside them. After a while, Sammy's gaze drifted, then returned, focused. Do you remember Chicago? He asked. Dean nodded. First show together, you showed up late and blamed traffic. Sammy's eyes warmed. I was scared, he said. Didn't know if I belonged, didn't know if that room was going to accept me. Dean frowned gently. You owned that room. Not until you walked over, Sammy said. Put your arm around me and said, stick with me, kid, I've got you. He paused. You didn't say it like a joke, you said it like a promise. Dean's eyes lowered. The memory had always lived in him, but he had never understood its weight until now. You kept that promise, Sammy whispered. For 30 years, in rooms that weren't kind, in cities that weren't gentle, you never let me stand alone. His voice trembled. People think Frank led us, but you were the heart. You made us feel like family. Dean felt something swell in his chest, something too large for the space he had built to contain emotion. We were family, he said. Sammy squeezed his hand weakly. And I want you to remember that when I'm not here to say it anymore. Dean nodded slowly. After a while, Sammy spoke again, softer now. When it happens, he said, I want you near me. I want your face to be the last one I see. Dean didn't answer immediately. He leaned forward until his voice was close to Sammy's ear. I'll be right here. Sammy closed his eyes, a small peace settling over his face. He drifted into sleep, his breathing shallow but steady. Dean stayed where he was. He did not check his watch. He did not move when nurses came and went. He simply sat, holding a hand that had once commanded stages, understanding that this, too, was performance of a different kind, a performance of presence. When Sammy woke again, the light in the room had shifted. Afternoon had arrived quietly. He looked at Dean as if surprised, then smiled. You didn't go anywhere. Dean shook his head. You asked me not to disappear. Sammy studied him, then asked, You scared? Dean hesitated, then answered honestly, Yes. Sammy smiled faintly. Good, means you still care. A nurse entered, offering medicine. Sammy took it slowly, then leaned back. He was tired but awake. Did you think about the music? He asked. Yes, Dean said, I did. Sammy waited. The slow version, Dean said softly. The one you liked late at night. The one you said sounded better after midnight. Sammy's smile deepened. That's the one, he whispered. Play it for me. I will. They rested again. The room felt sacred, untouched by the noise of the world outside. After a long moment, Sammy spoke, his voice barely there. Dino, can I tell you something I never said? Dean leaned closer. Anything. I always wanted to see you cry, Sammy said. Not because I wanted to hurt you, but because I wanted to know you trusted me enough to let me see the real you. Dean closed his eyes. Sammy continued. You spent your life being strong for everyone else, cool, untouchable, but I knew there was more. I knew how much you loved, how much you carried, and if you ever cry for me, don't hide it, let it happen. Dean's breath shuddered. Sammy's fingers brushed his wrist lightly. Crying doesn't make you weak, Dino. It means you had something worth losing. The words opened something that had been sealed for years. Thank you, Sammy whispered, for never letting me feel alone in a world that tried to make me small. Dean felt a sharp heat rise behind his eyes. He did not wipe it away. I love you, brother, Sammy said. I love you too, Dean answered. Sammy's breathing slowed, his eyes fluttered. Don't disappear, he murmured. I won't, Dean whispered, leaning forward until his forehead rested gently against Sammy's. I promise. Sammy nodded faintly, and then his hand relaxed. The room went very still. The machine continued its quiet rhythm, but something essential had left the space. A nurse stepped in, took one look, and understood. Mr. Martin, she said softly. Dean did not answer. He stared at Sammy's face, peaceful now, almost smiling. And then, for the first time in decades, the armor fell. His shoulders shook, his breath broke. Tears came not in careful drops, but in honest, helpless waves. Dean Martin cried openly beside the bed of the man who had been his brother through half a lifetime. No audience, no spotlight, no applause, only love finally unhidden. And in that quiet hospital room, something else was born alongside the grief. A promise, one that would follow Dean into a chapel filled with people. One that would break him in front of the world. And one that would remind everyone who watched that even legends bleed. The day the world saw Dean Martin cry. The morning of Sammy Davis Jr.'s memorial arrived quietly, as if even the sun understood that this was not a day for brightness. Lowe's Angels was wrapped in a pale, restrained light, the kind that softened shadows and made the world feel hushed. Outside the chapel, cars lined the street in long, careful rows, black and polished, reflecting the sky like still water. There were no flashing bulbs yet, no shouting crowds, no red carpets. Only murmurs, slow footsteps, and the unmistakable gravity that follows the loss of someone who belonged not just to a family, but to an era. Dean Martin sat alone in the back seat of his car for several minutes before opening the door. He watched people enter the building through the tall wooden doors, their heads bowed, their expressions subdued. Faces from decades of memory passed through his mind, dressing rooms, late-night laughter, smoky hallways, bright stages. The bracelet rested against his wrist beneath the cuff of his dark suit, its weight steady and grounding. He reached into his pocket and touched the folded note he had written days earlier. Show up tomorrow. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He had already kept it. When Dean finally stepped out, conversations nearby softened and then fell away. Some people recognized him instantly. Others simply felt the presence of someone who carried something heavy. He walked toward the entrance without looking around, his posture calm, almost formal, as if he were heading to a performance he could not cancel. Inside the chapel, the air was cool and filled with a low hum of voices. Soft music drifted faintly, chosen carefully, respectfully. Flower arrangements framed the front, white and muted, their scent delicate and almost sweet in contrast to the grief that hung in the room. Pews filled slowly with familiar faces. Musicians, actors, old friends, new admirers, people who had danced to Sammy's voice, people who had been inspired by his courage, people who had watched him rise in a world that often told him he didn't belong. There were quiet embraces, gentle nods, long looks that said more than words could. Somewhere near the front, Frank Sinatra sat, older now, his presence still commanding but softened by time and loss. He stared forward, hands clasped, jaw tight. He did not turn when Dean entered, but he knew. He had always known. Dean took a seat a few rows behind him. He folded his hands and stared at the space where Sammy's presence should have been. The stillness felt unnatural. Sammy had never been a quiet force. He had been movement, rhythm, noise, laughter, and yet here was a room shaped entirely around his absence. Dean inhaled slowly, deeply, steadying himself. He had cried in that hospital room. He had cried in a way he hadn't allowed himself to cry since his son died. He believed he had emptied himself there. But grief was never that simple. It didn't drain. It waited. As the service began, voices spoke of Sammy's life, his talent, his barriers, his brilliance. Stories were shared, some light, some reverent. There was laughter at memories of his humor and a fragile warmth when people recalled the way he made rooms feel alive. Dean listened, but he felt slightly removed, as if he were hearing about someone else's brother. His Sammy was not the headline figure being honored. His Sammy was the man in the hospital bed, whispering love with borrowed breath. His Sammy was the friend who had told him not to disappear. That was the Sammy who sat in Dean's chest now, quiet and heavy and real. Then the music began. It was not grand, it was not loud, it was simple, soft. The opening notes drifted through the chapel like something remembered rather than performed. Dean recognized it immediately. He had chosen it because it felt like truth, because it felt like the late nights, the private conversations, the moments when the lights were off and the world was smaller. The melody moved gently through the room, touching people without demanding anything from them. It was not a song for applause. It was a song for reflection. As the sound reached him, Dean's chest tightened. He stared ahead, jaw set, eyes fixed. He could almost feel Sammy beside him, almost hear him teasing the band, almost sense the quiet satisfaction he used to wear when music was doing what it was supposed to do. Dean's hands slowly curled into fists against his knees. His breathing deepened. His shoulders rose and fell with careful control. Images began to surface without invitation. Sammy laughing backstage, adjusting his cuffs, tapping his foot when he thought no one was watching. Sammy leaning toward him in dressing rooms, whispering jokes just loud enough to make Dean break on stage. Sammy standing under bright lights, daring the world to deny his brilliance. Sammy in a hospital bed, thinner than he should have been, eyes still warm, voice barely there. And then another image pushed forward, sharp and merciless. His son's face, younger, smiling, alive. The two griefs met inside him, not as separate wounds, but as one deep understanding. Love always leaves marks. Dean felt his throat close. The song continued, each note landing like a gentle weight. He remembered Sammy's voice in the hospital, soft but unyielding. Crying doesn't make you weak. It means you had something worth losing. Dean's jaw trembled. He tried to steady it. He pressed his lips together. He inhaled slowly through his nose, the way he had taught himself to do whenever emotion threatened to show. But this time, something was different. This time, he didn't stop it. The first tear escaped without ceremony. It slid down his cheek, warm and undeniable. Dean blinked once, then again. More followed. His breathing hitched. He lowered his head slightly, as if hoping the movement might shield him, but grief was not something that could be hidden once it decided to speak. A soft murmur rippled faintly through the pews nearby. Not whispers of gossip, whispers of recognition. People turned their heads slowly, carefully, as if they were witnessing something private and sacred. The man who had spent a lifetime being the calm one, the charming one, the unbreakable one, was crying. Dean's shoulders began to shake. His breath broke in a quiet, helpless way that no performance had ever produced. He raised one hand, not to wipe the tears away, but to press against his mouth as if to contain the sound that wanted to escape. It didn't work. A small, fractured exhale slipped through his fingers. His chest tightened. Another tear fell, then another. Frank felt it before he saw it. He turned slightly, just enough. When he did, he froze. Dean Martin was crying. Not politely, not quietly, not with the careful dignity people expect from legends. He was crying the way men cry when the last defense is gone, when love has nowhere left to go but out. Frank's eyes softened. His own vision blurred. He did not look away. The music carried on, filling the space where words could not. Dean bowed his head further, his body moving gently with the emotion he had finally stopped restraining. There were no cameras flashing, no reporters pushing forward, just the collective understanding of a room witnessing something rare, not the death of a star, but the humanity of one. Dean did not know how long it lasted. Grief bends time. When the song ended, the silence that followed felt immense. It wrapped around him, not empty, but full of memory, full of love, full of everything he had refused to carry openly for too long. Slowly, he lifted his head. His face was wet. His eyes were red. His expression was unguarded in a way the world had almost never seen. He did not apologize. He did not smile. He simply sat there, breathing, present. Someone nearby reached out and rested a hand on his arm. Dean did not pull away. Another person leaned forward slightly, eyes shining. Across the aisle, someone nodded at him with something like gratitude, not because he was famous, but because he had done what so many people are afraid to do. He had let himself be seen. As the service continued, Dean listened again. But he listened differently now. The stories didn't feel distant. They felt connected. Each one was another thread in a life that had touched more people than any one person could ever fully understand. Sammy had been many things to many people. To Dean, he had been a brother. And brothers, even when they leave, never really go. When the service ended and people slowly began to stand, there was no rush. The room lingered as if reluctant to disturb what had just happened. Dean remained seated for a moment longer, eyes closed, breathing steadying. He thought of the hospital room. He thought of the stage. He thought of the empty showroom and the whispered promise, "Don't disappear on me." He opened his eyes. He rose. And as he stepped into the aisle, something inside him felt different. Not healed, not whole, but honest. The armor he had worn for decades had cracked, and in its place was something more human, more fragile, more real. Outside, the light had shifted. The air was warmer. People gathered in small clusters, speaking softly, embracing. When Dean emerged, conversations paused. Some people looked at him with surprise, others with compassion, a few with something like relief. They had grown up with an image of him that allowed no space for visible sorrow, and yet seeing him cry had not diminished him. It had expanded him. Dean stood for a moment at the top of the steps and breathed in. He felt the bracelet against his wrist and turned it gently with his fingers. "I didn't disappear," he whispered, so quietly no one else could hear. "I stayed." He walked forward, not as the untouchable figure of decades past, but as a man who had loved deeply and lost painfully and chosen, at last, not to hide either. And somewhere beyond the reach of stages and spotlights, beyond the noise of applause and the silence of hospital rooms, the promise between brothers lived on. Not in memory alone, but in the courage to feel, in the willingness to show up, and in the tears that finally told the truth.